Good afternoon and welcome to the final session before lunch at AusCERT 2021 on the final day. My name is Valdemar Jacobson from Taruk Security and I will be your chair for this session. For our next session, we have a presentation titled Take Me to Cuba, being presented remotely from New Zealand by Kendra Ross and Mike Seddon. Please welcome our virtual presenters.
Thank you very much for that. And good afternoon to everyone. It's just gone 12 o'clock, so wish you all a good afternoon. It's great to see you all, except of course we can't see any of you, but we'll trust that somebody's there. So Kendra and I are here to take a look back in time. We're going to take you back to the 1960s when the airline industry faced a huge problem with their planes being hijacked almost weekly. Our goal during this talk is to take a look at the problems they faced, what they did in response, and consider if any of their learnings can be applied to InfoSec. Before we do that though, we will introduce ourselves, because it would be rude not to. Then after Kendra takes us through the journey of the airlines, I'll take a look at a few other industries, and then we'll look across all of their journeys and see if there are some lessons there that we can adopt into information security. Our plan is to leave enough time at the end for questions, which I understand you can ask using the conference app. So to start off, my name is Mike Seddon. I live in Auckland, New Zealand. I'm currently in Wellington, New Zealand. I work for Quantum Security Services. Quantum is a New Zealand security consultancy. We provide assurance services in both the technical, so pen testing, and GRC, governance risk compliance. Our customers are across both the public and private sector, right across New Zealand. I'm also co-founder of the New Zealand Internet Task Force, and I sit on the board with Kendra of the ISANs, the Information Security Awards for New Zealand.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Kendra, aho. Welcome and hi everyone from Wellington, New Zealand. Unfortunately, you can't see our view, but the sun is absolutely shining here for a change. I'm a long-time AusCERT attendee, first-time AusCERT presenter. And it was actually at an AusCERT about 9 years ago when we were there supporting a fellow ISANS board member for one of your initiatives, the Voluntary Control Standards for SCADA, that we thought, why are we in Australia, nothing against your great nation, but why are we there to celebrate the great successes of New Zealand security companies? And so from that, ISANS was born. I've co-founded and recently sold a couple of businesses in the cybersecurity industry. And as I had some free time on my hands, Mike decided that this was the time, the idea that we've been bouncing around since 2018 in the KiwiCon, that we really should step up and talk. I'm heavily involved in co-founded community groups in New Zealand, First Tuesday and Project Wednesday. And yes, there is a common theme that you can see going with days of the week. And we hope to introduce particularly Project Wednesday, which is a meetup for people new to cybersecurity or thinking about it as a career. We'd like to think that we could bring this into Australia soon. But I want to take you back in time to a time that was coined the golden age of flying. It was a glorious time, that is for those that could actually afford it, because it was about 5 times the cost it is for flying today. It really was for the wealthy and also for those that saved up for special occasions, like my family did when my parents finally took my siblings and I in 1976 on a DC-3 trip from Wellington to Taupo. Those days, you actually didn't need to buy a ticket. Sorry. You didn't need to buy a ticket. You could just rock on up and grab one straight away before your flight because there was no pre-screening of passengers or anyone before you got on the flight. Some of you watching this will actually remember the time where you took any luggage you wanted. It didn't matter what you packed, and put it on a trolley inside the terminal, which was then wheeled out to the plane. Again, absolutely no screening. The passengers would actually go with their family and friends if they were taking them to the airport straight to the gate and then onto the tarmac. Anyone could go onto the tarmac. You didn't just have to be jumping on a plane. And then you would take your hand luggage, again, whatever you'd packed. In 1976, my mother actually packed her vegetable knives because she said that the ones in the motels were just too blunt. You put your luggage, your hand luggage, in the overhead locker, which was unsecured, but it was designed for easy access for the passengers. In those days, security was actually all about protecting you on the ground, protecting you from pickpockets and from thieves. Just having a wee mouth issue. You dressed in your best suits. It was a special occasion to go flying. You wore your best suit with a tie and a tie pin. You had your best dress with your pearls, your stiletto heels, and your hat with your hat pins. I think you can get a sense of the theme that's going on here. It's certainly nothing like that today. We dress for comfort, and we're not even going to talk about the food. But once you were on the plane, the party absolutely started. The drinks trolley came out immediately, and you were served copious amounts of champagne and beautiful crystal flutes. There was whiskey and scotch, all served in crystal tumblers. And then, if you were on an international flight, there was actually a chef on board who would prepare your meal for you. And well, there was only one cabin, and everybody travelled as if it was business class, as it is today. The whole premise of aviation and flying was built on the idea that it was to compete with the trains and the buses and the ships of that period. And it needed to be easy, it needed to be fast, and it needed to be convenient. And then it was wrapped up in glamour. The aviation industry went gangbusters through the 60s and 70s because it was an economic boom and people were flying. The US government finally introduced an aviation body inside the Department of Transportation because flying had taken off and they now needed to look at regulatory elements around it. But as aviation and commercial aviation took off, so did hijacking. In a 5-year period from 1968 to 72, and yeah, Mike quizzed me on the maths, that is actually 5 years, there were 326 hijackings around the world. And 130 of those were in the US alone. And of that, 91 went to Cuba. Initially, planes were hijacked globally for transportation reasons. They were to get out of political regimes, and in Europe, they were called asylum seekers or escapees. But in the US, they were labelled hijackers or skyjackers. Because the hijackings and planes going to Cuba were so common, people would actually get on the plane and say, "Take me to Cuba," to the air hostess. It made for a great story when you got back to your PTA or to your next cocktail party. It was an absolute real adventure for people. So much fun. The airlines were footing the bill. Flight staff were trained to actually comply with all of the hijackers' wishes. Pilots, no matter where they flew in the US, carried maps of the Havana airport. Once you were there, passengers and crew were put up in what were 5-star hotels at the time. One was even purported to be on a white sandy beach. There were endless cocktails, stunning, beautiful food, and exotic entertainment. What wasn't to love about going to Cuba? Castro built quite a little empire off the back of this because he would charge the aviation or the airlines and the US government for releasing the planes. Usually within 24 hours, the planes were back in the air and returning to US soil. The passengers usually had a little bit extra luggage with them, usually some Cuban cigars or Cuban rum, which was illegal at the time. But what's amazing is that during that time period, over 1,000 Americans went to Cuba unexpectedly. It was so much fun that Time magazine actually even poked fun at it, saying and running an article about what to do when the hijackers come. Monty Python ran a parody, Take Me to Luton, a tiny, unknown little village in the UK, where the hijacker actually ended up in Cuba. The US government didn't view this the same, though. They started to see that this was an escalating problem, and they started to put pressure on the aviation industry. But this industry pushed back. They didn't want barriers in place for people to fly because otherwise they'd go back to those trains, buses, and planes. Plus, the cost of hijacking was cheaper than putting in the security controls. And more importantly, customers just weren't demanding it. But pressure started to grow, particularly from the unions. And so the FAA created a hijacking task force in 1968. And there were a huge number of ideas, like building a fake Havana airport, which was ultimately scrapped because they realized the hijackers would actually realize that they were still in the US and not Havana, or putting boxing gloves on the passengers, or injection seats to eject them out of the plane. What they settled on was the beginning of profiling. They developed 25 behavioural cues, which they gave to the ticketing agents to look out for. They were things like people wouldn't make eye contact with you, or they were wearing ex-military gear. As you can guess, it was an unmitigated disaster. Firstly, the ticket agents weren't trained properly, and the controls and the cues that they'd put in place were just too broad or wrong. At the time, a senator also suggested that maybe airports should actually implement metal detectors and X-ray machines like they were using in prisons successfully. But everyone, including the FAA, pushed back on that, saying that it would have a bad psychological impact on passengers because they would feel like they were in prisons. And like all things, criminal activity was growing and more criminals wanted to get in on the action. The 1970s saw a shift away from hijacking being about transportation to now ransomware, extortion, and also, in some cases, terrorism. We weren't immune down under. In 1971, Mr. Brown hijacked from the ground a Qantas flight. He told Qantas that he had planted an altimeter bomb on this flight that was going from Sydney to Hong Kong, and that they just had to look in the locker of an airport in Sydney, and they would be able to see the identical bomb that he had planted on the plane. They looked at the bomb, and in fact, they ran some quick tests on it, and it exploded, or the lights came on, even though they'd dismantled the igniter on it, at 8,000 feet. So the Qantas flight was circling for hours at 35,000 feet. The money, the 500,000, was ultimately paid to Mr. Brown and his conspirators, or his co-criminals, and they disappeared in a yellow combi van because the police had forgotten to initiate the chase and follow him. The plane landed with 15 minutes of fuel left. He had told them there was no bomb on site. But everything really changed in 1972. 3 fugitives in America hijacked Southern Airways Flight 49, and they asked for a ransom of $10 million. Southern Airways and the US government were able to actually get together $2 million. But remember that drinks trolley? Well, those hijackers had consumed all the alcohol on the plane, and they were so inebriated that what was $2 million felt heavy enough for them that they believed it was the full $10 million. So they instructed the plane to go to Cuba. Now, if that ransom had not been paid, they were going to fly the plane into a nuclear reactor. For the very first time, everyone saw that a plane could be weaponized into a device of mass destruction. Later that year, a Vietnamese student who was actually being expelled from the US for anti-war protesting hijacked a flight from Honolulu. He had a foil-wrapped parcel which he said was a bomb. By this stage, some of the flights were now containing air marshals. He'd picked the wrong flight, unfortunately, because the captain was also sick and tired of hijacking, of the crew getting hurt and injured, and in some cases, passengers dying. He decided at a refueling stop to convince the hijacker to come closer because he couldn't hear him. At which point, he and 2 of the other passengers overpowered the student. His tinfoil parcel turned out to be lemons. However, the pilot had given the sky marshal, who was an ex-cop, the go-ahead to shoot the student, and he fired 5 times, killing this guy. The captain decided that he wanted to make a statement. He took the body to the exit and dropped it onto the tarmac. The world press were watching, and very soon this image was beamed into homes around the world. The face of hijacking had now changed. The public image had a very different connotation. The fun was now gone. And Nixon, under enormous pressure, probably to deflect, decided it was time to do something. And in 1972, he mandated that all airports must now have X-ray machines and metal detectors. And on the 5th of January in 1973, this went live in all airports across America. The media descended on the large ones like San Francisco, expecting to find disgruntled clients and long queues, but they found the complete opposite. They found really happy customers who, for the first time in a little while, were feeling safe. In fact, that year, passenger numbers increased by 15%. The next few decades were relatively quiet with very few hijackings. In fact, in 1991 through to 2001, in the US, there were absolutely none. Internationally, there was more, such as the Lockerbie bombing in 1988. And from those learnings, internationally, we were now testing for explosives and searching hand luggage. And then the terrible happened, 9/11. And within a 2-hour window, the aviation industry changed overnight. Many of the international controls that have been created through standards were not being used domestically. Hijackers had actually set off the metal detectors, and subsequent photos and images showed that they were carrying box cutters and small knives. However, they were allowed domestically at the time. Some of the hijackers didn't have proper ID, but they were allowed onto the plane. But perhaps the biggest failing was that aviation security had been outsourced to private companies. It had become an increasingly competitive landscape, and often the lowest bidders won. It was simple economics. There was little investment in staff training. They paid minimum wage, so didn't attract the best of the best. Their equipment was old and outdated. The government at this stage took back over aviation because they could see that private enterprise was about turning a profit back to the shareholders.
Right, that's quite a journey, Kendra. I'm going to take a look at some other industries, but it's hard to imagine something being quite so traumatic and painful as that. The first one I'll pick on is the automotive industry, because cars have been around for longer than planes, over 100 years now, and so safety has to be a fact. In fact, even the very first demonstration drive of the first steam engine apparently crashed into a wall. So you can imagine one of the first controls, one of the first solutions was the addition of brakes. And of course, brakes have continued to evolve. Initially, it wasn't primarily as a safety mechanism, it was to allow the cars to go faster. The faster you go, the better the brakes need to be. Obviously, at a lower speed, those brakes are quite effective in protecting the occupants of the vehicle and more so the pedestrians in front of the car. But it wasn't until the 1930s when GM started doing some of their own crash tests, where they wanted to understand what happened inside a vehicle during an accident, what happened to the vehicle and to its occupants. As a result of those early tests, they established a number of standards that they built into their production line. And that, of course, included better brakes. But in those early days, a lot of the car evolution was more around comfort than safety. If you buy a car and the further the car goes on drives, the more comfortable you want it to be. So the early additions were things like radios and air conditioning and a good cigarette lighter and ashtrays for everybody. Safety wasn't the priority at that stage. In fact, cruise control was developed and put into vehicles before, that was in the 1950s, before Volvo in 1959 developed their 3-point seatbelt. Now, good on Volvo. After developing that as a highly effective control to what they saw was a problem, they made those designs available to all car manufacturers because they were concerned about everybody's safety, not simply just their own customers. Unfortunately, it wasn't for another decade after that before the US mandated that car manufacturers must install seatbelts. And even then, they said they needed to be lap belts and only in the front seats. Now, unfortunately, in some accidents, those lap belts cause more damage than they provide safety. So 2 years later, those mandatory seatbelt requirements were changed to include Volvo's 3-point seatbelt. But it wasn't for another 2 decades or so before a law was introduced saying that people should actually do the seatbelts up. I'm pretty sure it was during this period. I remember growing up as a kid in New Zealand, and I remember climbing up onto the back parcel shelf of my mother's Mini so that I could wave to the cars behind us, and no one seemed bothered about it. Of course, if that was to happen today, everyone would be horrified. So just like in the airlines, the car manufacturers knew that there was a problem and they understood how to fix it, but it came at additional cost. The Ford Motor Company in the 1950s made available an upgrade. They had this thing called the lifeguard package that included such safety essentials as those lap belts in the front seat, padded dashboard, safety glass, and it didn't sell well. The customers didn't demand it. Even Henry Ford himself accused McNamara of trying to sell safety while his competitors at Chevrolet were selling cars. The truth was, all the car manufacturers were scared. They were fearful that if they even offered a safety upgrade, their customers might think that their cars were unsafe when compared to a competitor's vehicle, when those competitors weren't offering an extra safety upgrade. In the 1970s, it changed a little bit when there was an independent body, and they established the crash test safety rating system. So they tested all the vehicles, and they came out with a number of standards that were applied to all car manufacturers. And through that, the safety features started to evolve quite a lot faster. And along with brakes, they improved things like mirrors and suspension and collapsible steering columns, padded instrument panels, crumple zones, airbags, laminated windscreens, and even better seatbelts. The safety rating has evolved. We all know it now as the NCAP safe 5-star safety rating. And bringing it down to a simple 5-star rating means that the consumers can now compare apples with apples. They're looking at a simple metric, and they're able to pick a safer car over a less safe car. This means the insurance companies have also been able to step in to incent their customers to buy safer vehicles by reducing the premiums of a 5-star safety rating car as opposed to a 1-star rating. Now, all of this is around the manufacture of vehicles. In New Zealand and many other countries, there's ongoing checks. In New Zealand, it's every 6 or 12 months, depending on the age. And the check is to ensure that some of those critical safety features that were built in as a result of these standards are still in place and still operating effectively. In addition to the warrant of fitness, every vehicle is registered to an owner, and everybody who drives has a license to operate. Now, as we look at the vehicles today, especially the higher end vehicles, they are starting to get a little smarter. They're becoming more aware of their surroundings, which means they are now able to anticipate and in some cases even avoid accidents. And as we move into the future and we look forward to a time of autonomous vehicles, it's anticipated that they will be able to eliminate the thing from the car that's most responsible for accidents. And that, of course, is the driver. The next topic I'll take a shorter look at is homes and building standards. Now, residential building standards have been driven, they benefit mainly from commercial and industrial building standards, and they, like everything we've spoken about so far, have resulted from quite big disasters. In the early days, the Great Fire of London resulted in building and urban planning standards that didn't exist before. Similar catastrophic events, often in those days fires, in other countries and cities also evolved into building standards in those countries. New Zealand is no different. We have a few extra building standards because New Zealand is on a number of major fault lines. So our building standards also take into account that every now and then the ground moves just a little bit. Beyond the way these structures are built, and more recently with the addition of how they are insulated, most of the options in that very first pitch that I brought up are up to the homeowner. The building inspector might come out at the final sign-off at the end of construction to make sure that it has smoke detectors and they're in the right place. But apart from that, everything is up to the homeowner. And it really depends on their own situation, their experience and their risk appetite as to what they bolt on as far as safety features and safety and security. In my own early career, I used to install burglar alarms. I had a home. I didn't have one in my own home until after I got burgled. Then my situation had changed, my experience had changed, and my risk appetite absolutely had changed. And so the next day, an alarm was installed in my own home. I remember in the good old days, not even locking doors of our houses. We do that now because of the risk of burglary. And just like in my previous example, this has allowed the insurers to start to step in and incent better behaviour. And they may offer a premium discount for homeowners who have a burglar alarm installed. And of course, insurers will help you when it comes to fires or earthquakes or burglary. Some of your choices they will leave completely up to you. My last other area that I'll take an even quicker look at is health and safety. So many countries now have very strict health and safety legislation. And here's something where a risk in isolation, while it may be bad, when it's considered at a much broader industry or country level, it's large enough to require legislation to bring it under control. So before a Health and Safety Act was in place, a lot of health and safety was managed and tended to be up to the industry-specific rules, and new rules were introduced typically in response to accidents, serious accidents that had already happened. So in New Zealand, New Zealand's Health and Safety Work Act was introduced in 2015. And by looking at injury statistics around that period, and I've looked more specifically at fatalities, I can see that in the time the legislation was being introduced and as it came into effect, the number of fatalities dropped to about 50 to 70% of what it had been in previous years. So you can see that the right rules at the right time have a very quick impact. And one of the reasons for that is within the Act, it defines who may be held responsible. It talks about the person who occupies a position that allows them to exercise significant influence over the management of a business. So what it's talking about there is the CEO and the board of directors. And because the Health and Safety Act can bring prosecutions and impose penalties, that previous clause makes it clear who will be penalised. And so the board of directors and the CEO are personally liable, which has resulted in health and safety featuring on the agenda of every board meeting now. So on to the lessons. The first question we have to ask after looking at those various industries is, can we even look across other industries and apply their lessons to InfoSec? And I think the simple answer is no, but it's always good to ask these things. That's the end of our talk. No, I'm kidding. Of course, there are lessons to be learned for InfoSec by looking elsewhere, but it's not going to be as easy as saying they did X, so if we do that too, we'll be okay. The airlines needed to make their cockpit doors stronger, but better hinges aren't the answer for us. Car manufacturers were forced to put the Volvo's designed 3-point seatbelt for every passenger, but the average office chair just won't be safer with a seatbelt. Every industry is unique. The risks they face and their responses are unique to them, but there are some common things. And one of them is people, why they do what they do or don't do what they should. Every industry may be unique, but people generally act the same. Those within the industry may understand the problem and how to fix it. But without understanding the issues, those outside the industry don't know what the controls are for until it affects them personally. So people are resistant to change until they understand the benefits. By being more transparent about safety control and it being in place, it will allow the consumer of a product or service to make a more informed choice. And as people see companies valuing their data and privacy, increasingly companies are turning this into a competitive advantage.
And through our journey, we've seen that terrible events have actually been the catalyst for government and regulatory bodies becoming involved. And we believe in the InfoSec side, we're on that pathway now. A common theme across all of those industries was they did well when there were global standards that could be deployed down to a local level. We can take really good local standards and take them out at a global level as well. We need to do it at speed, and our legislation and regulation needs to keep up, as they talked about the fact that we've digitised and done transformation in 5 years in the last 9 months. In the US, just yesterday, they created a new standard for federal. And one of the components of that we really liked was the fact that they're actually holding the private sector to account. There's almost a bill of materials built in now into the services provided to federal that will have to be supplied. You will have to guarantee what libraries and that they're secure in the code and the versions. It shouldn't always be about the consumer being penalised if something goes wrong. We believe it's actually time now that the enterprise or the software developers and the service providers are also held to account. And we believe that the public will be asking this. Just with the aviation industry, those successful controls, when deployed at an international and a domestic level, the rate of hijacking went down. There've only been 18 in the last 20 years. We would consider that to be a win. We feel we're heading down the track of a pandemic or epidemic level of cyber incidents. And we're hoping that this conversation we've had today has created some new thinking and thought and started and provoked a conversation around some of the other lessons and ideas we could bring in. We really appreciate you jumping into our conversation today and hope that there were some takeaways for you. I think we're probably maybe a minute or two for a question, if there are any.
Thank you very much, Mike and Kendra. That was a very insightful and thoughtful presentation. Nobody from the virtual or in-person audience has actually asked any questions yet, but I've kind of got one. Apart from the fact that clearly we seem to be having a bit of a dysfunctional insurance industry around cybersecurity regulation and incentivization, do you think that that insurance could actually, like in other industries, eventually become a driver for some of these improvements that we need to actually see?
So I think the simple answer is yes. If you look at the trend of how insurance companies work, they understand risk very well. What you may find, so we already have cyber insurance in a number of states, number of situations. I think what you may find is an equivalent to the scenarios that we spoke about. They need to incent good behavior. So for insurance companies to do that in cybersecurity, they need to understand what your current behaviors are. And so insurance companies are likely to play a larger role in how information security controls are implemented within an organization. And they will encourage and incent people who are putting in appropriate controls for the risks that they currently face.
Thank you. Hopefully we'll get to see you both here again in some years to come, having met you both in the past. But thank you once again for the presentation. It'd be really good to see you here again sometime in the future. And thanks
Look
again.
forward to it.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, we've now got lunch and we're back here in the split streams at 1:45.